Church planting is missionary work, it's a missionary task, and part of what the missionary does is exegete culture. Exegete may have been a word you've heard before applied to Scripture, and we should exegete the Scripture, explain it to God's people. But one of the things we've got to do is exegete the culture, to engage it, to understand it, to have a missionary encounter with people in culture. And it's kind of a fascinating passage here. Actually, Acts 17 is what missiologists often, in fact, it's probably most missiologists' favorite passage. They often go to Paul at Athens, though we're not just going to stay at Paul at Athens, but we want to recognize that Paul's our example, but it's Jesus who actually says, as the Father has sent me, even so send I you. Mission is rooted in the identity of God himself. God's a sender. God sends Jesus. Jesus sends us. Spirit is sent to us. But Paul can be an example as we look at the missionary task in church planting. Just a few things we'll walk through from Acts 17. A little 16, a little 14, 15 as well. But Acts 17 verses 16 through 34 will be our main text. Number one, Paul acknowledged their spiritual questions, right? So Paul's actually, well, let's listen to the text. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, so he's in Athens, he was deeply distressed when he saw the city was full of idols. I don't want you to miss this. Paul's engagement with culture does not say, let's adopt everything in culture. Let's just, without any thoughtfulness of the faithfulness or the fruitfulness of the cultural engagement, he was deeply distressed when he saw the city was full of idols. Verse 22, jumping down, it says, Paul stood up in the middle of the Areopagus and said, people of Athens, I see you're extremely religious in every respect. Now we're seeing some things going on here. Paul's actually acknowledging their religiosity, their draw to religion. So he's deeply distressed, he's full of idols, but then he goes from that distress to Jesus' mission. He says, people of Athens, I see you are extremely religious in every respect, for as I was passing through, we saw what he was distressed. As I was passing through and observing the objects of your worship, I'd even found an altar which is inscribed to an unknown God. Now, I don't have time to unpack all the history of that. A good Bible commentary would help you here. But it says, therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, he is the Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, neither is he served by human hands, as though he needed himself, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives everyone life and breath and all things. So Paul is actually troubled and then engages here. Now, this is the same Paul who says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. So if you're a church planter, you want to imitate Paul. This is not the first time he does this. In Pisidian Antioch in Acts chapter 13, Paul lays out a gospel message that begins rich in Jewish history. He's actually talking to Jewish believers. Rich in Jewish history, takes them through centuries of Jewish history and points them to the gospel. In Lystra, he's actually engaging a people who are maybe on the backwaters of the Roman Empire, right? So he talks about the harvest and the sea and the sun, but he points to, he doesn't quite get as far in Lystra, but he starts bringing them to the gospel, and then there's a riot, and there's more to it. At the Areopagus, he's actually engaging an Athenian culture, a higher cultural engagement with people, and he quotes Epicurean and Stoic poets and philosophers and more at the Areopagus. Why? Because one of the things that Paul knows is that culturally appropriate evangelism answers the actual questions being asked by a given culture rather than those questions the church believes the culture should ask. So we don't go into a church planting context and just shout what we think they should care about. We address the questions they have, and like Paul, we take them, whether it's Jewish history, whether it's nature and the harvest, whether it's Epicurean and Stoic poetry and philosophy, and brings them to the Jesus of the Gospels that saves us and offers the gospel to them. So depending on where you are, people are wondering how to be free of demonic spirits in the two-thirds world. We need to tell them that Jesus is the answer. If they're wondering how to be free of materialism and greed in the West, we need to tell them Jesus is the answer. So being this exegeting culture means we know culture so we might go into the culture, not so that we might just say the culture is fine as it is. Number two, Paul understood Athenian culture. He obviously does that, right? So he would contend for the gospel and contextualize the proclamation of that gospel in that culture. Paul actually comes right to and says, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. We don't hold back because we exegete the culture. We don't hold back on the truths of the gospel. Number three, Paul acknowledged the positive and rebuked the negative things in culture. He says, what you worship is something unknown. I'm going to proclaim to you. In every culture, there are things we're going to see that say these can be bridges across which the gospel can communicate. And in every culture, there are places where people have warped the image of God and more. Number 4, and finally, a reminder for us, he proclaimed Christ. He literally says, so this I'm going to proclaim to you. He proclaimed Christ. I want you not to miss this, right? Because as culturally relevant we can be, if we don't proclaim the gospel, our cultural relevance has become a goal when ultimately Paul uses it as a tool. Cultural relevance is not the goal. Sometimes it feels I go to a church or a church plant. It's like this church has really made a goal of cultural relevance. Cultural relevance is not the goal. It's a tool. It's a tool across which relationships can be built and the gospel can travel. So as we exegete our communities, let's know them well. Let's engage them for the cause of Christ, but let's use those bridges of cultural engagement as tools, not goals, tools across which the gospel can flow.